Coming up on KCCI 8 News Close Up, the results from the Iowa primary are in, how some of the most competitive races in the country and here at home are shaping up for November's general election. And President Joe Biden joins World War II veterans from across the world on the beaches of Normandy to commemorate the 80th anniversary of D-Day.
This is Iowa's news leader. This is KCCI 8 News Close Up.
Well, results are in for the 2024 primary, setting the stage for the general election just 149 days away. Democrats and Republicans across the state have weighed in and chosen their candidates for the final contest come November. Good morning, and thanks for joining us for KCCI 8 News Close Up. I'm Chief Political Reporter Amanda Rooker. Well, with the primary in the rearview mirror, we're now looking ahead to the general election. On the ballot, President, Iowa's 4 U.S. House seats, half of Iowa's 50 state Senate seats, and all 100 state House seats. Of those races, the fight for Iowa's 3rd congressional district will likely be one of the most competitive in the country. District 3 covers some of central and southwestern Iowa, including Des Moines, Adel, Ottumwa, and Red Oak. Republican incumbent Zach Nunn currently represents the district. He won by roughly 2,000 votes in 2022, narrowly defeating Democrat Cindy Yaxne and flipping the seat from blue to red. And it's likely to be a very close race again in 2024. In the primary election, Democrat Lenon Beckham easily defeated Democrat Melissa Vine, meaning Beckham will face Nunn for the District 3 seat in November. Both candidates served in the U.S. military and have experience in Washington. Beckham worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Nunn has served 1 term in Congress. Well, the District 3 race is already seeing national attention as Republicans and Democrats are both looking for competitive races to invest in. And it's not the only one, as you can see there on your screen. Iowa's 1st district that covers the southeastern corner of the state is also drawing donors and outside interests. Both parties say winning those seats could help them win control of the U.S. House in November. I talked to Iowa leaders in both the Democratic and Republican Party who both say they are laser focused on winning those congressional races. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee is already pouring money and resources into Iowa's 3rd and 1st district races. After fending off right-wing challenger David Pouch, Republican incumbent Marinette Miller Meeks will face Democrat Christina Bohannon for the 1st district seat. In District 3, Republican incumbent Zach Nunn is up against Lenon Beckham, who clinched a landslide victory in the Democratic primary.
Congress is going to be key for reproductive freedom, for Medicare and Social Security, for a lot of issues. These folks, Lenon Beckham and Christina Bohannon, are right on the issues where Iowans are.
Iowa House Minority Leader Jennifer Comfort says there's an appetite for new leadership in Congress, and Democrats are focused on turning out voters.
It won't be easy, but the enthusiasm, the national investment here really says that Iowa is a state that is more balanced than our current representation shows. And I think voters are going to want to get some of that balance back, too, by sending those 2 to Congress.
Now we move ahead.
But Republican Party of Iowa Chair Jeff Kaufman says Iowa's 4 Republican incumbents can go beyond campaign promises and point to their record, which he sees as a critical advantage.
Zach Nunn now has a record. Zach Nunn has a record, and you can compare what he said he was going to do in 2022 with what he has done.
He also says Republicans need to expand their majority in the U.S. House to get priorities accomplished. And Kaufman says that will fire up Republican voters to send their conservative representatives back to Congress.
But I think people understand if we want to turn things around in the economy and the border, people understand that a slim majority isn't enough to give President Trump what he's going to need in order to get the policies through.
And I know as we get closer to that general election, we'll be talking a lot about District 1 and District 3. But first, we want to reflect a little bit overall on that primary election. I'm joined now by KCCI political analyst Dennis Goldford. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Always a pleasure.
Well, talking about this primary race, we still only have preliminary data when it comes to how many people cast their ballots, but we're seeing relatively low turnout. I think the number that we had seen was about 8.3% of all registered voters turned out on primary night. But that may not tell, the whole picture, because that may include independents and other voters. What do you think may be helpful to look more at when we're trying to determine turnout?
On the one hand, we want to look at the percentage of active registered Democrats who turned out and the percentage of active registered Republicans who turned out. Technically, Iowa is a closed primary state. You can't participate in a primary unless you belong to that party. But on the other hand, you can change your party registration at the voting booth, at the polling place, so it's got some wiggle room. But I think that the broader point is that, as I've said for years, Americans talk a lot about the right to vote, but we don't really mean it. And we see, particularly with primaries, that turnout, absent some really compelling candidate or issue, tend to have tremendously low turnout. And that's important because primaries determine who it is you'll be able to choose among in the November election. And so when the primary turnout is as low as it is, you're leaving that decision as to who will be representing your party in November up to those activists who do turn out.
And when we look at those numbers that were just on our screen there, you know, looking at maybe 19% of registered Republicans turning out, you know, about 12% of registered Democrats turning out, that's still considerably lower than people that came out on primary night in 2020 and 2022.
Sure. It can vary from year to year. I mean, this isn't a midterm year when there's no presidential race on the ballot. It's a presidential year. That always, certainly at the November polling place, that boosts turnout. But what that does for primaries is another issue. And again, typically on a nationwide basis, on average, only about 20% of eligible voters nationwide actually show up to vote in the primary, and the Iowa numbers pretty much reflected that this time around.
Shifting gears, though, to the general election, where a presidential race will be at the top of the ticket. Of course, this year, it's likely it will be a Trump-Biden rematch. You know, how do you see that affecting whether or not this general election will heat up here in Iowa?
Well, one problem for both of them is that while certainly Mr. Trump has a hard core of really enthusiastic and dedicated supporters, Mr. Biden doesn't have so much. But still, there are a lot of people for whom this is blah in terms of who their choices are for president. That may depress turnout a little bit. On the other hand, when there's a presidential year, that tends to get more people showing up at the polling place, at least to vote for president. That doesn't mean that they vote for all the down ballot, down ticket races, though. A lot of people vote for president and walk out of the voting booth without voting for Congress or for state legislature or things like that. So that remains to be seen. But surely turnout in Iowa will be greater than what it was for the primary.
So I talked to Republican Party of Iowa Chair Jeff Kaufman, House Minority Leader Jennifer Comfort. One point that Kaufman made was that it's likely Trump will win Iowa, just given the fact of the high number of Republican registered voters in the state compared to, you know, Democratic registered voters in the state. He believes that will, you know, down ballot really help people like Zach Nunn or Miller Meeks. If people are voting for Trump, that they'll just go down ballot. Not surprising, but Comfort on the other side says no, she thinks that Iowans are able to separate things out, may vote differently, you know, a Republican or a Democrat for president, and flip that for who they're voting for Congress. You know, what do you make of those two arguments?
I think they're both legitimate, actually. I mean, if you vote a straight ticket, you just go and click one little lever or one little mark, and that covers everybody in that party. Up and down the entire ballot. If you want to do a la carte, so to speak, and pick and choose, that takes a lot more time and effort, and that can be difficult. But no, I think Mr. Kaufman is right. Iowa has been increasingly a Republican state. I mean, 25 years ago, we were still pretty much of a purple state, but certainly over the last 10 years, we've become very much of a red state, that is a Republican state. And Democrats have an uphill battle here in Iowa.
Well, we will continue talking about that, Dennis. Thank you. Still to come on Close Up, we look at how the primary results shape dozens of races for the state legislature. We'll be right back. At the Iowa State House, half of the 50 state Senate seats and all of the 100 state House seats are up for election in November. Many of those races are not contested, but there were nearly 24 House seats that had a competitive primary. That includes House District 34 in Polk County after Akeo Abdul Samad, after many years in that seat, vacated it. Rob Johnson won the Democratic side with 43% of the vote. He'll go up against Republican Danielle Duggan in the fall, who ran unopposed. She doesn't currently live in the district. She'll have to move there in order to be eligible on the ballot. Now, in House District 22, that includes West Des Moines and Norwalk, Samantha Fett earned 55% of the Republican vote, defeating Republican Garrett Gobble. Fett will go up against Democrat Rory Taylor in November. Turning now to House District 41, that includes Northern Ankeny. GOP nominee Ryan Weldon defeated Matthew Smith with 780 votes. He'll go up against Democrat incumbent Molly Buck, who ran unopposed in the Democratic primary. And there was also House District 51, which covers parts of Story and Marshall counties. GOP candidate Brett Barker, the mayor of Nevada, defeated another local government official, Martin Chitty, with over 1,100 votes. Barker will face uncontested nominee Ryan Condon on the Democratic side. So a lot of state races there. But Dennis, I want to return to talking to you a little bit about the congressional races we're seeing. Thank you for joining us. Talking about Iowa's 3rd congressional district, central, southwestern Iowa. That was an incredibly competitive race in 2022. We're hearing that it's going to be competitive again. What do you make of that?
Well, that's going to be a fun district to watch to the extent that politics is still fun, and that's an entirely other issue. But yes, Zach Nunn is in his first term. He did defeat an incumbent, Cindy Axne, but you know, when the district lines are redrawn after reapportionment, that can change who your voters are. But Zach did defeat Cindy, and he's in his first term. And if you're going to have a shot at knocking off somebody, your best chance is to try to get him or her in that first term. If that first termer wins re-election, then it's not guaranteed, but quite often it's the case that you can be there pretty much as long as you want. So the Democrats nationwide absolutely are interested in this district. And as you look at both parties, and it's reflected in Iowa, you know, we have an incredibly tightly divided House of Representatives in Washington, incredibly tightly divided Senate in Washington. And we don't have those tight divisions here in Iowa, but at the same time, when you think our Senate is 34 to 16 Republicans, that's a 68% majority. That's huge in political terms. And in the House, it's what, 64-36? Those are huge margins. And increasingly, we find it's not that you have sort of competitive districts all over the place. You have a lot of solidly red or Republican districts and a lot of solidly blue or Democratic districts, and it's whoever gets more of them who gets control.
Right, and you see then at the state level, legislation kind of eases through since Republicans have such a big majority. Meanwhile, I think anyone, even if you're not paying attention to politics, may know that's not the case in Congress right now with a divided, House and such a slim majority, which is maybe why all eyes are really on Iowa's 3rd district.
Well, there are other competitive districts around the nation, of course.
Sure.
But if it's tight, if the House is divided this tightly, any one particular district in November could make the difference. So sure, Iowa is very much in play in that regard.
Another thing, when Nunn won this seat, he beat a 2-term incumbent who had a lot of name recognition, had a lot of money. Is there anything for Democrats that could make them say, well, we can do better this time around when it seems they have a little bit more of an unknown candidate and maybe more of an uphill climb this time around?
Well, both parties are very desperate to win these elections. And as you know, as we've talked about for years, it's always the question of turnout. And I've said that generally speaking, Republican voters take voting more seriously than Democratic voters do. And so if Democrats can boost that turnout among their people, then they've got a chance. But at the same time, older voters take voting more seriously than younger voters, and older voters tend to lean more Republican than younger voters who tend to lean more Democratic. So all these factors in play, and it's just for the Democrats and the Republicans both. It's just ring the fire bell and get your folks out on Election Day.
Well, Dennis, I want to talk to you a little bit more about what issues may be motivating voters in the general election. That's when we come back. Stay with us. Welcome back to Close Up. Our conversation with KCCI political analyst Dennis Goldford continues. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, where we left off, we were talking a little bit about Iowa's 3rd district race and some issues that may play a central role as this campaign is now, hitting the ground and rolling on towards November. In 2022, that was, of course, right after Roe v. Wade, fell. We saw abortion access really play a central role between Zach Nunn, who was the Republican challenger, now the incumbent, and Democrat Cindy Axne, who lost in 2022. When Lenon Beckham, the Democrat who will now go up against Nunn, won the Democratic primary, one of the first issues he started to talk about was reproductive rights, and he really hammered that point home. Do you think abortion is something that could be an advantage for Democrats this time around?
Democrats certainly think that could be an advantage. Certainly the Republicans have become the pro-choice or anti-abortion party, and the Democrats have become the pro-choice, if I mix those up,
Sure.
and the abortion rights party. Sure, and Democrats think this will certainly be an issue for them, particularly insofar as supposedly some Republicans or some people affiliated with them are even talking about trying to restrict forms of contraception. And we saw an issue blow up about in vitro fertilization and all that. So Democrats think that's a particular issue. Political parties and candidates don't just have this neutral, even slate of issues to choose from. They grab a hold of the issues they think will maximize their chances of winning an election. And so Republicans have always tried to motivate and get to turn out. Certainly religious conservatives are very much against abortion rights. Democrats are trying to motivate those who are in favor of abortion rights.
Obviously, Polk County is in Iowa's 3rd district. There's a lot of voters there. But if you look at the rest of the makeup of the district, seems like a lot of more rural areas, maybe places where abortion doesn't resonate, as much. Any thought on that?
Well, remember, we've always had a rural-urban split in the country for as long as we've been around, but increasingly that rural-urban split is working in favor of Republicans. Republicans have more support in rural areas, although there are fewer people there. Democrats have more support in urban areas where most people live. I think 70% of Americans live in what counts as urban areas. But that's one of the reasons why the central Iowa district, whether it's the 3rd as it is now or the 4th that it used to be, has become more Republican because of including more of those rural areas. And we have this kind of rural-urban gap, we have an education gap, and we have all these divisions. And candidates tend to think they win elections by motivating their base, revving them up, as opposed to trying to gain new supporters by talking to them and trying to convince them. They just want to get their base out. They think that's what wins elections.
We always hear from you, turnout, turnout, turnout.
That's right.
Especially in Polk counties that still feel like that's the case for this district?
Oh, sure. I mean, Polk County, of course, is not entirely Democratic by any means. But if Democrats are going to have any fighting chance in the 3rd district or in relevant state house elections, they've got to get a good turnout in Polk County.
Well, Dennis, as always, thank you so much for joining us and being here. I know we'll talk to you frequently as we get closer to November.
Sure.
Well, when we come back, the leaders and World War II veterans who traveled to France this week to honor the 80th anniversary of D-Day. Welcome back to Close Up. This week marked 80 years since the D-Day invasion of Europe. It was a turning point in World War II for the Allies in the war against Germany. It led to the liberation of Western Europe under Nazi control. It also meant the end to the mass extermination of Jewish people in Europe. President Joe Biden spent time in France last week participating in D-Day ceremonies. His administration hopes that will deepen ties with European countries as the fighting continues in different regions overseas. Some of the veterans involved in D-Day also returned to France, each with a story to share.
It's hard to describe all these people. Never think they recognize old veterans, you know, what our country really means.
My only wish is that the people in this country would appreciate this country.
President Biden and First Lady Jill Biden met World War II veterans one by one ahead of a memorial ceremony at the Normandy American Cemetery on Thursday, presenting each veteran with coins made to commemorate the D-Day anniversary. He chatted and joked with some of the men, asking about their hometowns, thanking them for their service, and calling them the greatest generation ever. The president delivered remarks at a commemoration ceremony that was also attended by members of Congress from both parties and Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi. He spoke about the tens of thousands of American men who poured onto Normandy's beaches that day, charging into a hail of gun and mortar fire.
There were men from all over America. It was estimated that 80% of them would be killed within hours. That was the estimate. But they were brave, they were resolute, and they were ready. One soldier told General Eisenhower, quote, "Don't worry, sir. The 101st is on the job. Everything will be taken care of." That's what he said. And because of their courage and their resolve, because the courage and resolve of their allies, it was taken care of. From the sea and sky, nearly 160,000 Allied troops descended on Normandy. Many, to state the obvious, never came home. Many survived that longest day, kept on fighting for months until victory was finally won.
Iowa Representative Mariannette Miller Meeks honored and remembered those involved in the invasion on the U.S. House floor.
It was on the shores of Normandy that our brave troops, with hearts full of patriotism and determination, stormed the beaches to confront tyranny head on. Let us remember those courageous souls who gave everything for the cause of freedom. Their bravery, their unwavering spirit embodies the very essence of what it means to be an American. As we reflect on
Miller Meeks herself is a 24-year Army veteran. Less than 1% of the veterans involved in D-Day are still living. Well, thank you for joining us for KCCI 8 News Close Up. We'll see you back here next Sunday. Have a great day.